Hi, I want to talk for a second about a brief history of welfare in America and understanding that in relation to our national government and how those two things would work together. Um, Welfare itself was created out of the Social Security Act of the 1930s. Social Security Act was passed in response to the Great Depression and the tremendous need that existed in the country as a result of 25% unemployment, massive home foreclosures, bank closings, and other really difficult economic circumstances like that. Social Security Act itself states in the preamble that it is a law created to provide for the general welfare of the American people. And that phrase, general welfare, is important. You remember that from previous conversations, that in the Constitution, the power to tax in Article 1, Section 8 is limited in that it can only be for the general welfare. The taxation can only be for the general welfare of the American people. But even very early on in our history, in the National Bank controversy, and many, many times since, including the Social Security Act, um, leaders have argued that the phrase general welfare is actually a power in itself. As you know, Thomas Jefferson argued strongly against that idea, that the Social Security Act would adopt the argument that the general welfare phrase actually is a power in the Constitution and that the government can do whatever they term is in the um, interest or for the general welfare of the American people. And thus we have the creation of the Social Security Act in the 1930s and subsequently the modern welfare state, which comes out of that. The act itself established, as you know, I'm sure you're familiar with Social Security in other ways, that it has pensions for elderly people, and it also has provisions for people who are disabled, and it has within it a welfare program. The original Social Security welfare program was called ADC, Aid for Dependent Children. It was designed only to provide aid to women, single women with children. It was not to aid beyond the children, actually, and it was very specific, and they actually would establish some parameters to make sure that there were no men in the house, there wasn't a man living in the house, there's no father or husband there, in order for the woman to receive aid. And this is kind of a cultural thing back then in the 1930s. Their understanding of a woman who had children was that a woman was not able to work outside the house and therefore could not provide care and for those children as far as financial care, and so they would consider a single woman with children actually as disabled. And so ADC was designed to benefit those children of single moms. For the first 30 years or so, up until about the 1960s, there were never more than about a million Americans on welfare, or what's called, or on ADC, that program ADC. In the 1960s, we adjusted the welfare program and renamed it AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. And at that time, we did some very significant changes to the program. The first was that it could go, as the name states, to families instead of just to single moms and their children. So there could be a dad there. And then, secondly, in the 60s and 70s, we really attempted to make welfare a much more acceptable thing to receive. Before that, there was a lot of stigma associated with receiving welfare. In the 60s and 70s, we attempted to make it a little bit more user friendly, make it acceptable, and we did a lot of different things to encourage people to apply for welfare. The result of which, within about 15 years, the number of people on welfare had increased from about 1 million to 14 million people. And obviously, this in the late 70s and 80s brought some alarm to the idea of a modern welfare state with so many Americans receiving these benefits. In the 1990s, we changed the program again to what's called TANF, TANF, Temporary Aid to Needy Families. Notice the key word there, temporary, that we want welfare to be temporary, can only be on it for so long. Um, it also should, they thought, under TANF be less than a working wage, and that you should be seeking work while you're on welfare. And these are some of the principles that existed actually prior to the creation of the welfare state. The central question here is, whether or not the government, the federal government, has any right to create such a system. I know that we all might have various degrees of view about helping poor people. I certainly believe that it's a responsibility of individuals in our society to help poor people. The question is, does the federal government have the power to extract money from one group of people and aid another? And under what power exactly would that be effectively done and be constitutional? The Social Security Act and subsequent welfare programs argue that it is under the General Welfare Clause or phrase that is in the Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. And obviously, in other conversations, we can at least at minimum view that as problematic.